He had a heart waiting for him, a perfect match, right there, 20 minutes away, and he told me no, not out of fear, not out of confusion. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I know whose heart that is. Dr. Harris, and I would rather die than carry it." That was the moment I understood this case was never going to be about medicine. Subscribe for more medical stories like this. New cases every week. The rain had been coming down since before my shift started. The kind of slow, relentless drizzle that makes the air feel smaller than it already is. Every sound sharper, every silence heavier. I remember the squeak of wet boots on the waxed floor. The way the fluorescent lights above Bay for buzzed at a frequency I'd stopped consciously noticing years ago. I was on my third cup of coffee that had gone cold before I could finish it, holding a chart I'd already read twice without retaining a word. 26 hours without a full night's sleep will do that to a man. It was the kind of night where I moved on muscle memory and experience alone, my body going through the motions while my mind lagged somewhere 3 steps behind. Marcus Hale came in at 11:47 p.m. Brought by a neighbor who'd found him slumped against his kitchen counter, barely conscious. He was 54 years old, with the kind of face that had once been strong but had been quietly hollowed out by something that had nothing to do with physical illness, deep-set eyes, a jaw set to tight even in semi-consciousness, hands that gripped the gurney rail the moment he came around, as if letting go meant falling somewhere he couldn't come back from. His admitting paperwork flagged him immediately. Advanced dilated cardiomyopathy. Ejection fraction at 19%. Already enrolled in the transplant program at St. Clement's for the past 8 months. His cardiologist, Dr. Prianer, was paged within minutes. I stayed with him until she arrived. He came around slowly, the way patients do when the body is conserving everything it has left. I introduced myself, kept my voice level, watched his eyes track the ceiling tiles before they found me. There was something in that gaze that I couldn't place right away. Not fear, not pain exactly, but a kind of exhausted vigilance. Like a man who had been waiting for bad news so long that he'd stopped being surprised by it. He told me his name without being asked. He told me he knew how serious it was. He told me, almost as an aside, that he'd stopped taking 2 of his medications 3 weeks ago. He said it flatly, without apology. The way a man confesses something he's already made peace with. Dr. Nair arrived 20 minutes later, reviewed his echo results, and pulled me aside into the hallway. His numbers had dropped significantly since his last check-in. His heart was functioning at the absolute lower limit of what could sustain life, and that margin was narrowing. She told me quietly, professionally, that if a donor match didn't come through in the next few weeks, we were likely looking at hospice conversations. I nodded. I'd had those conversations before. I knew how they went. What I didn't know yet was that the match had already come through, that night. While Marcus was still being stabilized, a notification had come through the transplant coordinator's system. A compatible donor heart had become available. The timing felt almost cinematic, almost merciful. It wasn't. I went back in to sit with him while we waited for the transplant team to be notified. The room was dim except for the monitor glow, and he was lying still. His breathing shallow but controlled, a man who had learned to ration even that. On the small table beside the bed, someone had placed his personal effects in a plastic bag. Through the clear plastic, I could see a wallet, a phone with a cracked screen, and a folded photograph that had clearly been handled so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. I didn't ask about it. Some things you learn to wait for. I told him there might be news about a donor match coming through very soon, and I watched his face carefully as I said it. Most patients, even the frightened ones, have a flicker of something when they hear those words. Relief, or hope, or terror. Marcus Hale went absolutely still. Not calm. Still, the difference matters more than most people realize. He thanked me. He closed his eyes, and I stepped out into the hallway thinking the hard part was going to be the surgery. I was wrong about that in every possible way. The transplant coordinator, a sharp, efficient woman named Sandra Okafor, reached me at the nursing station just before 1 a.m. with the confirmed match details. Donor compatibility was excellent, blood type, tissue markers, organ viability, proximity. She was already coordinating with the surgical team. All we needed was Marcus's formal consent to proceed. It should have taken 10 minutes. I walked back into Bay for with the consent forms, a practiced calm on my face, and found him sitting upright in the bed. The cracked phone in his hand, the folded photograph open on his knee. He was staring at it with an expression I had no clinical name for. I sat down across from him and placed the forms on the tray table between us, without pushing them forward. I'd learned a long time ago that the moment you push paperwork at someone, you've shifted the dynamic. You're no longer their doctor, you're the institution. I asked him how he was feeling. He said, "Like I have 19% of a heart. There was no self-pity in it. It was just math." I told him the match had come through, that the organ was viable, that his surgical team was ready. I told him this was what we'd been waiting for. He looked at the forms for a long time without touching them. Then he said, "Who is the donor?" I told him what I always tell patients in that situation, that donor identity is confidential, that the family would need to consent to any disclosure, that it wasn't information I was able to provide. He nodded slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something rather than denied it. He picked up the photograph and held it toward me. It was a woman mid-40s, dark hair, laughing at something outside the frame of the picture, caught in real joy rather than a posed smile. He said her name was Diane. He said she had been his wife. He said she had been killed 14 months ago when a pickup truck ran a red light at 40 miles an hour and hit the driver's side of their car while they were coming home from their anniversary dinner. The monitor beside him continued its steady rhythm, indifferent. I kept my face neutral, but something in my chest shifted. He hadn't finished. He told me he had spent the last 14 months doing what surviving spouses do, the paperwork. The grief counseling, the slow, terrible work of dismantling a life shared with someone for 22 years. He told me he had eventually gone back to work, eventually started sleeping through the night most of the time, eventually stopped flinching every time he heard a car horn. And then, 8 months ago, he'd been placed on the transplant list, and he had told himself that was a reason to keep going. He had believed that. He had tried to believe it. He folded the photograph back along its worn creases and set it on the tray table beside the unsigned consent forms. Then he told me the driver of the truck had survived the crash, had walked away, had been charged, convicted of vehicular manslaughter, and sentenced to 4 years. He told me the man's name. And then he said, very quietly, that he was almost certain the available donor heart belonged to that man. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. I did not confirm or deny it. I couldn't, not legally, not ethically. But Marcus Hale had been watching my face for the last 3 minutes with the focused attention of a man who had nothing left to lose. And whatever he read there was enough. He set the consent forms back on the tray table, face down, and told me he needed to sleep. His oxygen saturation was dropping incrementally on the monitor above his head, each small number a quiet countdown. I stepped out into the hallway and stood there for a moment with my hand still on the door frame, trying to find the medical problem to solve. There wasn't one. The medical problem had a solution. It was everything else that didn't. I paged Dr. Nair and asked her to meet me in the consult room off the main corridor. When I told her what Marcus had said, she sat down slowly, the way people do when a situation reorganizes itself around them faster than they can adjust. She asked me if I'd confirmed the donor's identity. I told her I hadn't and wasn't going to. She asked me what his psychological state was. I told her it was, and I chose the word carefully, coherent. He wasn't confused, wasn't in crisis, wasn't medically incapacitated. He was a man making a decision, which made it a vastly different clinical and ethical situation than a patient who couldn't consent. Dr. Nair pressed her fingers to her temple and said what we were both thinking. If he refused the transplant with full mental capacity, there was nothing we could do. Nothing legal, nothing ethical, nothing that didn't cross a line that existed for essential reasons. We called for a psychiatric consult, which in a situation like this is both standard practice and, if I'm honest, a way of buying time while hoping someone with more tools than us can find a way through. Dr. James Whitfield arrived within the hour, a lean, deliberate man in his late 40s who had a gift for sitting with people in silence without making it feel uncomfortable. He spent 40 minutes alone with Marcus, while Dr. Nair and I waited at the nursing station and did not talk much. Sandra Okafor checked in twice about the transplant timeline. The donor heart had a viability window. That window was not infinite. Every hour Marcus spent not consenting was an hour moving toward a point where the choice would no longer exist, not because he'd made it, but because it had expired. Dr. Whitfield came out and closed the door softly behind him. He told us Marcus was not clinically depressed, not psychotic, not in a dissociative state. He had full insight into his prognosis. He understood that refusing the transplant was statistically equivalent to choosing death, and he had told Dr. Whitfield that he understood that, and that some things weighed more than statistics. He said it without dramatics. He said it like a man who had done the arithmetic and accepted the answer. Even though the answer was unbearable, Dr. Whitfield said what he found most significant was not the refusal. It was what Marcus had said underneath it. That accepting the heart felt like forgiving the man who killed his wife. That carrying that man's heart in his chest felt like being complicit in the erasure of what had been done to her. That every heartbeat, for the rest of his life, would belong to the man who had taken Diane from him. I stood in that hallway and felt the full impossible weight of what we were dealing with. This was not a psychiatric case. This was not a capacity case. This was a man being asked to make room inside his own body for the person he most needed to hold responsible, and finding that he could not. I had seen patients refuse treatment for fear, for denial, for confusion. I had never seen a patient refuse treatment for grief carried this completely, this deliberately. The ethics board was going to need to be involved. Legal was going to need to be consulted. And all of that would take time that the viability window was quietly consuming with every passing minute. Dr. Nair suggested we try once. More, that Dr. Whitfield go back in, not to persuade, but to sit with Marcus and see whether there was anything in the conversation that hadn't yet been said. I agreed, not because I thought it would change the outcome, but because I believed Marcus deserved to have someone present who was willing to go further into that grief with him rather than around it. There is a difference between respecting a patient's autonomy and abandoning them to it. I'd learned that distinction over 25 years, in rooms very much like this one, and I was not willing to forget it now. Dr. Whitfield went back in. I stood outside the door this time, close enough to be available, far enough to give them the room they needed. The hallway had the particular quality of late-night hospital silence, not quiet exactly, but a kind of noise that recedes into background. The monitors and the distant voices and the wheels of the medication cart all becoming a single ambient hum that you stop parsing. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way I almost never am anymore. 25 years of emergency medicine will dull most things, but standing outside a room where a man is choosing whether to live, not in spite of his grief, but through it, has a way of stripping the professional distance down to nothing. 40 minutes later, Dr. Whitfield opened the door and looked at me. He said, "He wants to talk to you, not to the transplant coordinator, not to his cardiologist. To me." I went in. Marcus was sitting the same way he had been since he arrived, upright, hands on the rail. That contained stillness, that looked like calm but wasn't. The photograph was in his hand again, Diane's face visible at the fold. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke, and what I saw in his face wasn't resolution. It was something rawer than that, the expression of a man who has gone to the very bottom of something and found there was still further to fall. He told me, Doctor. Whitfield had asked him what Diane would have wanted. He said he'd been furious at the question, said it felt like manipulation, but then he'd sat with it, really sat with it. And he said, and his voice broke for the first time since I'd met him, that Diane had been a donor herself, that she had checked the box on her license at 23 years old and never changed it, that she had told him once, offhandedly, that she couldn't think of a better use for a body than giving someone else more time. The monitor continued its arrhythmic stutter. His saturation had dropped another 2 points since I'd last checked. I didn't look at the numbers. I looked at him. He told me he didn't know if he could forgive the man. Told me he didn't think he was capable of it yet, possibly ever. But he said that maybe, and he put weight on that word. Maybe. Like it was the only weight he had left to give. Carrying the heart wasn't the same as forgiving the man who had owned it. That a heart didn't carry guilt. That Diane would have known that. That she would have been angry at him for throwing away his life in service of a rage that wasn't going to bring her back. He reached out and picked up the consent forms from the tray table. His hands were trembling, not dramatically, but with the fine, exhausted tremor of a body that has been running on too little for too long. He uncapped the pen that had been sitting beside the forms since I'd set them down hours ago. He looked at me once more, and what I saw wasn't peace. It was something more honest than peace. It was a man deciding to keep going despite everything. Not because the pain had lifted, but because he had decided barely, imperfectly, at the absolute last possible moment, that it wasn't finished with him yet. He signed his name. I picked up the forms, stepped out, and told Sandra Okafor to proceed. She was on her radio before I'd finished the sentence. The surgical team mobilized, with the specific, controlled urgency that only happens when time is genuinely critical. I stood in the hallway as the room around me shifted into coordinated action and felt something I don't feel often anymore, a kind of profound, aching relief that had nothing to do with the outcome being certain and everything to do with a man choosing to find out. The surgery lasted 7 hours and 12 minutes. I wasn't in the OR. That wasn't my theater to stand in, but I stayed in the building. I told myself it was because I had charting to finish, which was true, but not the reason. I drank bad coffee in the break room and read the same paragraph of a cardiology update 3 times, without comprehension. Dr. Nair came out of the OR just after 9 in the morning with the particular exhaustion on her face that looks like relief wearing a disguise. She told me Marcus had come through. The heart was beating. His body was accepting it. She said accepting, and we both paused for a moment on the word, aware of everything it was carrying beyond the clinical definition. I went up to the ICU 2 hours after he'd been moved there, once the immediate post-surgical fog had begun to clear. He was intubated and sedated, the way patients always are in those first hours after cardiac surgery. The room dense with equipment and the soft rhythmic sound of the ventilator. But the monitor above his bed showed a heart rate, steady, strong, real. 64 beats per minute. I stood in the doorway and counted several of them before I went in. There is something about a heartbeat on a monitor after a night like that which feels less like data and more like an argument, the body insisting on itself, continuing against everything that tried to stop it. His neighbor, a quiet older woman named Ruth, had arrived sometime during the surgery and was sitting in the family waiting area down the hall. She was the one who had called the ambulance, who had ridden with him, who had sat through the night in a plastic chair with a paper cup of tea gone cold. I sat with her for a few minutes. She told me. Marcus and Diane had been the kind of couple you didn't see often, the kind that still held hands at the grocery store, still finished each other's sentences, still laughed at things no one else in the room understood. She said the 14 months since the accident had changed him in ways she couldn't fully articulate, that he had become quieter in a way that was different from his natural reserve, a quietness that felt more like absence. She said she hoped, and she folded her hands around the cold cup when she said it, that now there might be room for something else. Marcus was conscious and extubated by the afternoon. I looked in briefly. He was not talkative, not transformed, not wrapped in the kind of narrative resolution that the movies would have written for him. He was a man who had just undergone major cardiac surgery and was very tired and in pain in navigating a body that had been opened and repaired with someone else's essential organ. He looked at me when I came in and said, "Still here." I said, "Still here." That was enough. Some moments don't need to be more than what they are. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. I have stood at the bedside of people who chose to die. Not passively, not by accident, people who looked at what medicine was offering them and said, quietly or loudly or with great dignity, "No thank you, not like this." I have learned, over 25 years, to hold those choices with respect even when they broke something in me. Because autonomy is not conditional on the choices being ones we would make ourselves. What I had not encountered, before Marcus Hale, was someone choosing to die not out of acceptance, but out of grief. Not because the fight was over, but because the cost of continuing felt like a betrayal of everything the fight had been for. That is a different thing entirely. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand it. What Dr. Whitfield gave Marcus, that night, wasn't therapy and wasn't persuasion. It was a question asked at the right moment. What would Diane have wanted? That question didn't heal anything. It didn't resolve the anger, or close the wound, or produce forgiveness. But it created one small opening in a wall Marcus had been building for 14 months. And through that opening came something, not peace, but possibility. The possibility that continuing to live was not a concession to the man who had killed his wife, but an act of faithfulness to her. I think about the heart often. Not medically, clinically, that case resolved cleanly. Marcus was discharged 3 weeks later and enrolled in cardiac rehab, but philosophically, in the way that some cases do when they stop being cases and become questions. A heart is a muscle. It doesn't carry identity or sin or the moral weight of the life it sustained before. It doesn't remember. It doesn't forgive or refuse to forgive. It simply beats. And yet for Marcus, that simple beating was the most complex ethical question he'd ever faced, which tells you everything about how grief works and nothing about how to fix it. I don't know if Marcus ever forgave the man. That isn't my story to know. What I know is that he chose to stay. And I know that Diane, who had checked that donor box at 23 years old and meant it, would have understood something that Marcus was still learning, that the heart is not a ledger. Isn't keep score, keeps chimney. It simply goes on, if you let it, beating its way through all the things you thought were insurmountable, making room for whatever comes next, whether you're ready for it or not. That night taught me something I thought I already knew, and apparently needed to be reminded of, that medicine's hardest cases are never about the body. The body is almost always the easy part. It's the person inside it, carrying everything they've lived through, that requires the most careful attention. That requires someone willing to sit in the room without rushing toward a solution. I was not always that person in my early years. I'm still not always that person now, but I try. Case by case, shift by shift, cold coffee by cold coffee, I try.